Welcome to Books at Berkeley. I'm your host, Judy Pinnolis, Associate Director of Instruction and Engagement at the Berkeley Library. We're speaking today with Dr. Pooja Agarwal. Dr. Agarwal is an Associate Professor of Psychology here at Berkeley, where she teaches courses in introductory psychology, cognitive psychology, and social psychology. She is the lead author of the book Powerful Teaching: Unleash the Science of Learning, a previously featured book on Books at Berkeley. Dr. Agarwal is known for her award-winning research into how students learn, which has been featured in the New York Times, Education Week, Scientific American, and on National Public Radio. She earned her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. We're going to be discussing the recent book Dr. Agarwal edited called Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning: Practical Tips from 10 Cognitive Scientists. Welcome to Books at Berkeley, Dr. Agarwal.
Hi, Judy. Thanks so much. This is so fun and exciting.
I'm so happy to have you today. I wanted to tell our audience a little bit about the book. It consists of 10 essays by different scientists and teachers in the field. So, what is the purpose of this book and why did you put this all together? And
Yeah,
I guess the title, what does the title tell us?
yeah. The title can be a little bit of a mouthful. So, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, the title itself refers to being smart teachers. Everyone who teaches at Berkeley, everyone who teaches around the world, we're all experts at learning. We're the ones in the classroom. We've spent 1 year, in my case, 10 years at Berkeley teaching. And so we're already smart teachers. My hope is with this book, by learning a little bit more of the research behind learning, but especially from scientists who are also teachers. This is a smart teaching book to become more informed and also stronger learning, which is a goal we all have as educators. So by being better informed as smart teachers, we can then rally around this goal of stronger learning. I like to say to my Berkeley students on the first day of class that they're spending a lot of time, money, and energy to be at Berkeley. So I hope that throughout my course with them and through many of the techniques we'll talk about, that they remember what they are learning at Berkeley beyond the 15-week semester, beyond the year that they're in, beyond their 8 or 9 semesters, that they really do strengthen that learning for the long term, and it carries them through their adulthood and new adventures. So smart teaching, stronger learning. As you mentioned, there are sort of 10 mini chapters. There are only 10 chapters, 10 pages each. So it is intentionally very short. It's about the third of the length of my first book, Powerful Teaching. And I wanted to bring a team together of 10 scientists who, again, are experts in learning, but they are all also teachers. And this is really important to me because they've done their own research in the laboratory setting, in classrooms from other teachers, but they also know how to apply the strategies they talk about in their own classrooms. So it's kind of double evidence from the scientific standpoint and also from their own classroom. They have taken these strategies, implemented them, tweaked them. And so each chapter shares a little bit of research, I would say maybe 10%, but the rest of the mini chapter really focuses on how they teach with practical examples, bullet points, really easy tips that you can use immediately.
Yeah, it's great to have both the scientific theory and the fact that there's practical applications that have been tried, and there's a lot of experience behind the tips that are in the book. I wanted to focus a little bit on a few areas that were covered in the book that were sort of interesting to me. Uh, and that was the transfer of learning. So I know this is especially important here at Berkeley. As you mentioned earlier, you want people to take the knowledge that they're hearing and learning about with them later. We have so many experts who are teachers. They are experts in their field. They're successful practitioners in music and the arts. And they are, of course, concerned of how to successfully transfer that knowledge and expertise in music. Um, when and how does this learning happen and how to do that? That's really kind of the question. And how do the steps in this book help define and sort of simplify that process of transfer of learning?
Yeah, it's an important question, especially at Berkeley. I'll start by saying transfer is hard. It's something we all want as teachers, and a lot of learning shows that transfer from knowledge to new situations, to new examples, to new areas of music is a challenge for us as human beings. It doesn't happen quite as naturally or as easy as we'd expect, and it's not as natural or easy as we want it to be. And so what I really like about research on transfer is that the exact same strategies throughout the book, one of them being retrieval practice that I talk a lot about, simply practicing what you know helps you with transfer. And from the scientific theory standpoint, we talk about near transfer and far transfer. Near transfer is like doing addition problems and then, the basic formulas for adding, and then near transfer would be to word problems. That's
Mm,
very similar in new situations. Far transfer could be learning about the causes of the Civil War and then applying that to someone's understanding of the causes of World War II. So those are different concepts and knowledge bases, but we still want students to take one area of their knowledge and transfer it to the other. Now, in music, I should say, Judy, I'm not a musician. So this is important for me to mention at Berklee. I played violin for 10 years as a kid. So I actually played violin from age 6 through 16 through high school. And I used the Suzuki method. And so I was trained in learning violin by ear.
mhm.
Um, and now, as an adult, I've been very surprised. I can't sight read. I literally can't sight read. And I did this for 10 years. So for me, that transfer of when I eventually learned how to sight read has not really worked throughout my adulthood. At the same time, I do feel that my knowledge of music in a sort of childhood level has transferred to my understanding of what my Berklee students are talking about in the classroom. They throw out a lot of jargon that I don't understand. We talk about how science has jargon and musicians have jargon. The circle of fifths, I don't know that I will understand ever what that is. But I do think from my musical training as a kid, I can transfer that to what I'm hearing, to my appreciation at the symphony, to my appreciation of modern pop music. And that is kind of further transfer. So in the classroom at Berklee and in otherwise, I think, again, because I'm not a musician, sometimes my students help me think through this. An aspect that maybe Berklee professors would like to see, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Judy, is maybe with core music classes, like ear training, for example. When students take ear training 1, 2, and 3, we want them to be able to transfer that to their upper level classes at Berklee.
Yeah.
And some research shows that that happens, especially with music. The more you learn about music, the more you can apply it in new situations. And that's actually similar for other liberal arts and sciences classes. The more students learn about music history, the better they'll understand and transfer to new historical contexts. The more they learn about composers, the better they'll be able to transfer that knowledge to composition classes. So there's research showing that knowledge of music transfers from one situation to another, but it's hard. It's really, really hard. And so you had asked about at least one strategy, I think, about how to help with this. And
Mhm.
one that in that mini chapter by Dr. Stephen Pan, he talks about the use of hints and scaffolding. That sometimes because transfer is hard, it's not that students are incapable of that transfer, it's just that they need a little hint or some help, or what we also call scaffolding, like literally scaffolding on a building. So if a student has learned some aspect of music in their composition classes, but then they're having trouble transferring it, that might be a situation where you have to break it down a little bit more, or you literally give students a hint of, hey, this thing we're listening to applies to this new thing we're listening to.
Mm.
Let's talk through the process of what is different or similar. So sort of breaking down that transfer process to simpler steps can be really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of the concepts that you talk about, such as retrieval and, familiarity and going over things at different times and spacing, are certainly familiar to musicians and in so many ways. And I want to get to that also. Um, with music, people know you have to practice. You have
Yeah.
to continually do it. People also practice in different ways, but one of the ways is breaking it down into small measures or sections
Yeah.
and doing that over and over until it becomes familiar. So there are a lot of the things that are talked about in the book that have seeming, direct application, or musicians are already doing that and maybe calling it something different or
Mhm.
aspects of it. And then it's a matter of tweaking that with the knowledge, the scientific knowledge of how this works, maybe being able to tweak some of the way that they get students to do those kinds of practices or do this kind of application. It seems to have a very direct, specific application, as well as in general classrooms of liberal arts and sciences and economics, history, and so on.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, I was wondering also, well, just for our audience, a little bit to just briefly describe what is a retrieval process. We've been talking about it around it already, and I realize
Yeah.
we haven't really defined that for the audience a little bit to talk about what we're uh, theorizing here.
Mhm.
If you could just tell a little bit about that.
Yeah. So retrieval practice is a process of learning memory that I've spent 20 years conducting research on. And it's what musicians do is that they practice. The retrieval aspect comes from kind of the idea of a golden retriever who goes to fetch something and brings it back. Retrieval practice is thinking of something you have learned and then practicing it. So this is an aspect that just kind of was a light bulb moment when I came to Berklee, was that musicians and students at Berklee are some of the best learners. They know that they have to practice their instrument.
Right.
Otherwise, they're not going to get better. No matter how much they just listen to a song or watch a YouTube video, they have to actually pick up their guitar and play and practice to get better at guitar. So really, retrieval practice is just another phrase or describes the process of practicing an instrument. And when, again, on the first day of classes with my Berklee students, we share kind of this analogy or metaphor between music and retrieval practice. And I say that just like you practice your instrument, in my class, you're going to practice your knowledge as well. So when students learn about the science of sleep and REM cycles and circadian rhythms, then we practice their knowledge throughout the semester. What do you remember about REM cycles? What do you remember about the myths of power naps? How does this apply to your own life? Those types of questions are retrieval, asking students to think back to what they've learned. And it's also a strategy we already use as expert teachers. All teachers engage their students in retrieval practice, discussion questions, homework, again, whether it's a problem set from a math class at Berklee or it's homework for ear training, that's all retrieval practice. But I think musicians do it in a way that many college students don't.
Mhm.
What many college students do is they reread their textbook or they
Yes.
take notes and they reread their notes. And
Mhm.
that's how they prepare for an exam. What other college students also tend to do is they tend to cram. They do all of this rereading right before an exam, which makes
Right.
sense. Research shows that getting information into our heads with rereading and cramming improves short-term learning. Retrieval practice improves learning over the long term, and getting information out of our heads improves that learning. So rather than typically focusing on getting information into students' heads, again, in liberal arts and sciences or other types of colleges, we want to pull that information out of students' heads. And another way I realized this at Berklee is students at Berklee don't cram the night before a gig. They don't start studying or practicing the night before playing at the Berklee Performance Center. They know
Right.
they have to practice, and they know they have to practice every day or every other day or every week. So sorry, going back to this, retrieval practice is practicing, but it's specifically practicing knowledge of math, history, science, and most research on retrieval practice has been done with non-music subjects because practicing is so inherent to music that we do research on music and learning in kind of other ways that I'm happy to chat more about.
Well, music is so complex in so many different ways than other text-based learning or
Yeah.
uh, in in general. And yet it's interesting to see that the theories that have been adapted to learn music have, uh, as it has evolved, have a basis in science. I wanted to talk a little bit about another theory. For example, it's an important learning concept in music to recognize patterns, especially patterns of melody or patterns of harmony. And those must be recognized through time, such as the structure of a sonata allegro form or the return of a theme in an opera. You're supposed to remember it as you're hearing it,
Mhm.
and hear these patterns. So, how does the science of learning go into recognizing and retaining patterns, if you will? I don't know if that's a question
Oh
exactly
yeah,
to science,
yeah.
but
The
that's kind of what I was interested in, because when we practice, we have treatment, but in music, you hear things through space and time, as it were.
yes.
And I was wondering if you could address that.
Yeah. Pattern learning is really important, of course, especially in music. And an area and a strategy I love talking about, especially at Berklee, is a strategy called interleaving. It's also sort of similar to the word interweaving, like weaving a basket. And interleaving is a strategy that's particularly effective to learning skills and procedures and patterns. So rather than sort of discrete facts about the Civil War, interleaving is a fantastic strategy for music learning and pattern learning. And interleaving is just this simple idea of mixing up the order of steps or mixing up the types of patterns that students are learning. So for example, and this is a strategy that when I talk with my students at Berklee, they aren't familiar with, but then they try it throughout the semester. If a student is learning a song and they practice the song, of course, and typically when I ask students, where do you start? If you're practicing a song, do you start in the beginning, middle, or end? And they say the beginning. I said, okay, that makes sense. You want to play the song all the way through. And then I say, so what part of the song do you remember the best? And they say, the beginning, right? And with interleaving and mixing or shuffling, my students and I talk about starting in the middle of a song. Or if they're learning lyrics, they could start in verse 3 and then verse 2 and then skip to the end and then skip back to the beginning and then skip around, then play the second half of the song, play the first half of the song, and then put it together. And that kind of shuffling and interleaving helps students sort of glob onto the muddy middle. I had a student use that phrase once. It really helps them if they lose track of where they're at in the middle of a song. If they've skipped to practicing the middle of the song, it'll increase their learning of it. What
Mhm.
interleaving also does is pattern learning, because when students are shuffling or mixing things up, that then cues them to what are the similarities and differences between this first verse and this fourth verse. What are the similarities and differences between this really hard passage I'm trying to play and this other really hard passage I'm trying to play? Otherwise, as students learn a song in order, they're not necessarily comparing and contrasting. That helps with their procedural memory, muscle memory. But by interleaving and skipping around, that's where students are exposed to this pattern recognition, the
Mm.
discrimination, the comparison, and contrast. So Dr. Leslie Ann Harrison in the ear training department at Berklee has been engaging students in interleaving and doing some research on this at Berklee, where she first teaches students, I think, like a 5-step process for transcription. Here are the 5 steps. You listen to the song, you write down the rhythmic shorthand, you write down the notation, and so on. So students first learn the order that she goes through for ear training. And then with interleaving, she mixes up the order. So she'll say, now start with rhythmic shorthand. before you engage in other steps. Sorry, I'm blanking on the other steps, but before you engage in step 2, let's skip to step 5. So teachers can do this in the classroom if, and this takes some planning, but thinking about different patterns or different skills and orders of steps is to then mix them up. And I can give one more example from art
Okay.
history,
Okay.
which I think is related to music, especially with remembering a lot from music history. In art history, there's been this neat research where when students were learning paintings by different artists, so
Yeah.
paintings by um, Impressionist artists, Manet and Monet and another type of artist. If students in this research study, when students were learning all the paintings by Manet, and then in a block, all the paintings by Monet, and then they were given new paintings, they were okay at identifying which artist did which. But when students mixed up the order of the paintings, so they didn't always learn 5 paintings by Manet and then 5 paintings by Monet and then 5 paintings by Renoir. When they learned the paintings in a mixed up order, then with new paintings, they were much more successful at identifying which artist had painted
Style.
which. And so
Hmm.
with musical compositions or composers or music history facts, the exact same thing applies. Rather than learning history in a chronological order, or maybe first learning it in chronological order, is to then skip around to help students with that comparing, contrasting, and pattern learning.
Well, that's really fascinating. Uh, wow. Uh, I'm sure I wish I would have had that experience.
Me too. Well,
I'm
and
used.
even for something as simple as encouraging, if students are using flashcards, it's just shuffling up the order of flashcards.
Yeah, we years ago flashcards were kind of the rage. We had to memorize things like vocabulary in foreign languages or whatever. And I'm wondering like what were we doing that wasn't as there was a step missing maybe
Yeah.
or something that we were doing differently that wasn't working as well as what you're talking about.
Yeah, yep. There are a few tips I can give for flashcards based on research. Flashcards are still retrieval practice. So it's a great way to learn is to use flashcards rather than rereading notes or vocabulary words. Flashcards are good. Of course, now we've got online tech tools. Some students use one called Anki or Anki. There's one called Quizlet. Kahoot in the classroom is an example of retrieval. With flashcards, whether it's online apps or literal drawn out index cards like I used in college, one thing students can do is to shuffle it up to use interleaving. If they go through their flashcard decks online or in index cards in order, they're always going to do the best at the first flashcards at the top of the deck.
Yeah,
So
yep.
making sure, right, making sure to shuffle it up is really important. Another thing that students do that they could do better is they often, if they get something correct, they drop it from their deck.
Oh, mm,
And students drop things from their deck too early. Research shows that students should ideally retrieve something correct or get a correct answer at least 3 times before they drop it from their deck. It could have been a lucky guess. It could have been a correct answer, but a student could have had kind of low confidence. So students should keep cards in their deck for at least 3 correct retrievals to really make the most and optimize the amount of time they're spending on flashcards anyway.
oh,
Um, yeah, another thing students can do with flashcards is to make sure they are actually retrieving. Now, I would make this mistake in college where I'd see a flashcard and say, oh, I know that definition, and I would flip it over. But I wasn't actually trying to retrieve
say
the answer. So research shows that retrieving, saying it out loud, saying it to a
it.
friend, even just writing down the answer
Yeah,
before flipping the card, again, is sort of studying smarter and not harder. You're making better use of the time you're already spending.
yeah. We used to call it self-testing.
Mhm.
You see the flashcard, you write the answer, and then see if you were right.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly the same thing.
So I hope that works. Um, so another thing that I, was thinking about in terms of tweaking and wishing I would have had back when I was studying is this idea of rereading material from notes or whatever. And you were talking about retrieval before rereading instead of
Mhm.
rereading and then trying to think of your retrieval. And
Yeah.
can you explain that a little bit? I thought that was a fantastically interesting and really maybe crucial for some folks
Yeah.
piece of information about studying. It's not just going over your notes and rereading it and becoming familiar again,
Yeah.
but then doing something differently that you're
Yeah.
thinking about.
Yep. And you hit on a good point is when students are defaulting or going toward reading their notes or rereading textbooks, it creates this sense of familiarity. Like, I got
Right,
this, I know it. And then students can walk into an exam and totally bomb it. And then
right.
it's like but
Don't
how, I was
remember.
so prepared. Yeah, because I thought it was there, but it wasn't actually there.
Right,
And this happens in classrooms too for us as professors. We might start class by reviewing information. All right, class, here's what we talked about last week. So here's what we're going to talk about today. And a simple switch to do things differently, as you said, is to first ask students, what do you remember from last week?
right. Have
Give
them
them a moment to even think about it or to write it down, and then to tell them, here's what it was and here's what we're going to do today. Is giving just that extra 30 seconds or 1 minute is going to help their learning beyond the 15-week semester, which I love. And it doesn't have to take that much time. And so, to your point, asking retrieval questions before revealing the answer can be really important. And one of the authors in this new book, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, Dr. Shanna Carpenter, she has done a lot of research recently on what she calls pre-questions or pre-tests. As a play on words, she also calls it pre-trieval as opposed to retrieval, which I love. And there's research showing that what a lot of teachers do is to ask questions first before they go into a lesson or a lecture, and that's good for learning. That's a good thing to do. Of course, that could take extra time. I'm a realist. I know that I only have 3 hours with my students once a week. I teach in 3 hour blocks, so that can be fun. But I do have students at Berklee say it's the fastest 3 hour class they've ever taken. But anyway, starting with pre-questions can take some time, but it can be effective in the long run.
yeah.
So as Dr. Carpenter talked about recently, if a teacher is giving students learning objectives or an agenda for class, is to turn those into kind of teaser questions
Mhm.
before going into the lesson or class.
Yeah. What looking ahead, what might we look at here and what is it what is interesting to ask a question about?
Yeah,
Uh, Getting that question stewing in the head before and then when they hear it, it becomes, "Oh, wait, we were looking for that."
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, so it's great. I just loved all of these hints on teaching. They were just great. Um, we talked a little bit about scaffolding, so and I just thought that that was such a great idea about the helpful hints. But I guess one of the things that people might be asking is, well, how much is enough data on scaffolding to give to students so that they're getting these sort of helpful hints without really giving them the answer and that we're providing
Yeah.
too much information and essentially telling them the answer without them retrieving it.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
that sort of fine line in there, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions for people in dealing with developing scaffolding.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, it's something I think about a lot because I want to be mindful of that in my own classes. And scaffolding is important. A lot of great teachers, I'm sure teachers at Berklee already provide scaffolding. We don't go from A to Z at 70 miles per hour. Sometimes there's a fire hose of information, but that happens at any college. With scaffolding, one thing I've noticed that I do myself is I want to give the answer too quickly. And part of that is because I think as we as teachers naturally want our students to succeed. And when we see them struggle, that's when we want to jump in with the answer. But we all know that we learn the best from our mistakes. And research backs us up. We call it desirable difficulties. You have to mentally struggle a little bit before getting to the answer. And that's good for learning. So it's scaffolding. Expert teachers already do it. We provide hints, we help students out, but being mindful of not jumping in too soon, not picking up a child who just fell down and saying, oops, but giving them a moment to breathe and to think is really, really key. And this is something when I'm working on my language skills, I'm always trying to improve my Spanish. And when I'm practicing my Spanish, I'm nervous. I'm a bit embarrassed because it's not very good. But then if I'm struggling to think of a word and someone jumps in with the answer immediately, then I haven't practiced that knowledge. It's sort of like, oh, okay, I got the answer. That was easy. But I have to sit with it and try my best to come up with the Spanish word or to come up with the translation before I get that help. So being mindful, we can't jump in with the answers too quickly, I think is a helpful strategy for learning that's also backed up by research.
I talk to my students sometimes. I tell them that, it's like dead radio air. You have to be able to,
Yeah.
and on the radio, 3 seconds is a tremendous amount of time.
Mm.
But humans in one-to-one and or in a classroom or talking to each other need more time than that. And we have to allow that silent space to happen.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
before we press the person for a response.
Yes.
Um,
Another strategy along with that I've noticed with teachers is that for anyone at Berklee or at any college who uses a common strategy, think, pair, share. You give students a prompt, they think about it, they pair up with someone in class, they talk about it, and then they share with the class. Think, pair, share.
yeah,
What we often do is we skip the think step because
yeah,
we're uncomfortable with that silence and we love it when our students are talking and engaging. So think,
right.
pair, share is another situation where we just need to sit back in that awkward silence, let students think. I often have my students write something down before the pair and share. And my English language learners at Berklee find this particularly helpful because then they've thought of what they want to say before they're put on the spot, or
Right,
they've written down what they are thinking about before they're put on a spot with a partner. So the ELL students, I think, really benefit from that think time, and research shows all students benefit from that think time as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, processing time to actually have, if you ask a question and say, do you have a question? People have to think of a question.
Right,
Do I have a question?
exactly.
Maybe, maybe not. Do I have a question? So we
Yeah.
do need time to think about that. And it's something that that it's okay. And our culture doesn't seem to have any patience for
Mm,
silence, but we should
yeah.
maybe think about that. I was
Yes. Yeah. And I found that in my own classes, the more I do that at the beginning of the semester, the less awkward it feels. Then throughout the semester, my students are used to sitting in silence for like 3 minutes, which feels like a long time. But
the
then you'll find it actually feels shorter and shorter the more students get used to it and the more we as professors get used to that silence in the classroom. If you were to walk past my class, it would look like they're all taking an exam, but they're actually just writing down their thoughts before the parents share.
That's great. That's wonderful. Um, one little quote that really fascinated me in this book, and I wanted to mention it was learning leads to motivation.
Yeah.
Rather than what a lot of the folks say, motivation leads to learning.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you could just address that concept a bit
Yeah.
as we round up this discussion.
Yeah, that's in a mini chapter by Dr. Cynthia Niebel, and she's done research on motivation and learning. And as you said, we often think about needing to motivate our students to help them learn. And one way we do that is to give them grades or points, right? We know that points are a motivator for our students. So if we motivate them, they will study and do well, hopefully, and learn. And what Dr. Niebel talks about is that learning also leads to motivation. For example, in my classes, when students have learned more and have a better understanding of research on childhood development, when they have a better understanding and they've learned what are the stages we go through as children, then they're more motivated to learn about the stages we go through as teenagers and adults. Or the more my students learn about neuroscience and how the brain works, the more motivated they become to watch extra videos or to do some extra readings. The more my students learn about social psychology and how we develop interactions with groups, the more motivated they become to notice these interactions in everyday life. So of course, motivation leads to learning. And I think part of the point in that great chapter is that we can be mindful that the more we strengthen learning, the stronger learning aspect, the more our students will be motivated. So it may be, and she has this diagram in the chapter, it's more of a cycle. If
Mhm.
we can motivate students to learn, they learn more, then we can continue that motivation and learning process. Dr. Nemo calls it the effective teaching cycle, is to just cycle through that motivation and learning and being more intentional of the learning aspect to help students feel confident and to motivate them to learn the next thing.
Right. And I also thought that that it plays on the curiosity factor.
Mhm.
If you learn some interesting things
Yeah,
about topic, you may have the curiosity to want to know more. Uh,
yeah,
and
exactly.
that was a great chapter in the book. Well, that learning cycle was shown. They showed a process as defined as motivation, scaffolding, and reinforcement,
Mhm.
and that's sort of a cyclical thing. I love the part in when the author gave as an example when a student asks, "Do I have to?" Just so and saying no one likes to be told what to do. They want to be
Mhm.
able to self uh motivate themselves.
Yeah.
Um, well, I really enjoyed this discussion so much.
Yeah.
Definitely so many things in the book. And as the last kind of topic, I thought if we have time, I would cover, and that was this idea of neuromyths.
Mm, yeah.
There's a lot of misinformation or mythology, if you will, uh, that are out there about the mind.
Mhm.
And I have to tell you, I've certainly encountered my fair share of them as
Yeah.
an academic librarian for over 35 years. Um, everything, I guess, previous fads or theories or whatever I'm
Mhm.
learning through the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Um, the different learning styles and boosting more percentage of our brain and all of
Mhm.
those things that we heard all the time back then. The average person doesn't really know more or less how to keep up with all of that,
Yeah.
I guess. How do we deal with that fact that some of these things stick around, and how can we
Mm,
find out more about what's really true
right.
today, or the new side, or the new research has shown us?
Yeah.
Right.
It's neuromyths are everywhere. Because we as humans are fascinated with the brain, this 3 pound thing in our head that you're using and I'm using right now. We're using our whole brain and we use our whole brain nearly 24 hours a day. So that's one neuromyth is we only use 10% of our brain. That's not true. You and I are seeing, we're looking, we're talking, we're moving, we're using language, we're doing things that happen throughout the entire brain. When our students are watching Netflix, they're using the whole brain. When we're making coffee, we're using the whole brain. And so understanding and acknowledging we have this fascination with the brain. That makes sense. And I can see how we want to do quick things to unleash our brain power. We want to eat the right things. We want to listen to the right things. I think many people at Berklee are familiar with the Mozart effect, which is a neuromyth, right?
Yeah.
Playing music or listening to music as babies does not make you magically smarter. That's a neuromyth, but we're always looking for these quick fixes.
Right.
So I talk about neuromyths with my students and how to avoid them. And still, and it's a myth buster I love using in my class, is, with a little suspense and tension. One of the most common neuromyths research shows, and I found at Berklee, is that people believe that brain games improves their learning, their memory, their attention. So there are a lot of apps for brain games. Things like playing Sudoku or even things like crossword puzzles. And this neuromyth, I think, is appealing because we want something quick and easy and fun to make us smarter, faster, better. But research shows, and this connects with our first question, research shows that what happens when you play brain games, including crossword puzzles and Sudoku, is you get really good at the game.
Right.
It does not make you a better musician. It does not make you smarter at writing papers. It does not make you a better songwriter. You just get really good at
Look,
Sudoku.
right. It's okay.
And you get really good at Sudoku or the brain games, so you feel like you're getting smarter, but you're not. So this is what we call near transfer. Research shows that there might be slight transfer from one type of brain game to doing well on a test, but that seems to only last for less than a day or two. That near transfer doesn't really happen. And the far transfer from brain games to being good musicians definitely does not happen. So how can you avoid or at least be aware of these neuromyths? And this is one of the mini chapters in the book by Dr. Roberta Acuni in Brazil. One of the ways is to just be aware that brains are cool, but people can use them in misleading ways. There's a research study I talk about with my students at Berklee where it's this wonderfully simple study where these researchers at University of California, Los Angeles had college students read scientific articles. And I'm using air quotes because they were completely fake, made up articles.
Oh,
And they
okay.
had college students read fake articles. And the researchers included pictures of brains, pictures of bar graphs, or no pictures, all of which had nothing to do with the fake articles. It was literally just pictures of brains or pictures of bar graphs. And the college students rated the sort of trustworthiness and the logic of the articles as higher when there were brain pictures. That's it. That's it, right? So if someone is putting pictures of brains on something and they don't know anything about neuroscience, or someone is selling a brain-based curriculum or a brain-based music lesson, those are probably maybe not actually based on neuroscience research. So a
Yeah.
simple thing to do is even if you're not going to go down a rabbit hole and read technical journal articles like you and I might, understandably people don't have time to do that, is to just simply ask like what study is this based on? Or if you're reading a news article is just to see is there a reference or a link to something? Or if someone is saying something about the brain, just Google them and see, do they have any scientific background in this neuroscience research? Or are they just saying studies show that play brain games and your brain will get smarter? If something says studies show, then just ask what study. So being mindful that putting brains on things and using words like neuro drinks or, brain games for children, just be mindful that that could be taking advantage of our desire to know more about the brain.
Sounds like we need a Snopes for brains.
Yes, we do actually. That's a great one. I have a quiz, a neuromyths quiz on my website. And once you take the quiz, then you find out answers and resources. But a Snopes one is a good website. Thanks for the idea. We can start one at Berklee.
Um, well, I wanted to say about this book that every chapter there's an about the author with links to more information about that and their individual research areas. So when the people read this book and look at it, you can pick out any individual chapter and find out more about that specific aspect of learning. And also, it was very nice that the arrangement in the book had, as a librarian, I thought,
Yeah.
nice that there was something about the author and their information in their chapter and not all at the end, because then you could kind of really associate that person with the information that they're writing about. And so I appreciated that. And also the succinctness of the book. It's very succinct, it's easy to read. And for educators who are really busy and they don't have a lot of time to invest in, all of these techniques, can use this book as a resource, and it's very, very quick. There's very easy, bulleted forms of all the facts and the pertinent data, and then all of these very interesting tips for teaching that have been tried and true with these various educators, and also based on science that they've researched. So that was really a great thing to use, and I hope many people will use the book in their teaching and get all these helpful and it's especially for starting teachers or teachers who are new to the classroom and they're experts in their field, but they may be new to teaching. It's a great place to start. So thank you for getting this to us and
Thank you so
putting all that
much.
information together. I was very excited to read it. And thank you for coming to Books at Berkeley to talk about your book and engage us in learning so much more about the science of learning and its applications in everyday life. Thank you so
Oh, thank you so much. I love this, and I love particularly speaking with Berkeley students and faculty about learning strategies and simple things we can do, whether it's in music classes or in liberal arts and sciences. So thank you. This is so much fun.
You're very welcome.